The evacuation sirens had fallen silent 3 days ago, but Kale Voss still heard them echoing in his dreams. At 14 years old, he understood what silence meant on Meridian Colony. It meant that hegemony had won. He pressed his face against the grimy viewport of the abandoned supply depot, watching the alien transports glide between the settlement's skeletal remains like predatory fish. The Velter had come in overwhelming numbers, their crystalline ships blotting out Meridian's twin suns before unleashing waves of plasma that turned prefab homes into slag. The lucky ones died in the first bombardment. The unlucky ones were dragged away in binding nets destined for the slave pens of distant worlds. Kale had been neither lucky nor unlucky. He'd been forgotten. The evacuation shuttles had lifted off in chaos, families separated by panic and desperation. His parents, Dr. Elena Voss and Commander Marcus Voss, had died defending the medical center where wounded colonists sought shelter. In the confusion that followed, no one had thought to check if their son made it aboard the final transport. By the time anyone realized the mistake, the ships were already jumping to hyperspace, and Meridian belonged to the Velter hegemony. 3 months had passed since then. 3 months of hiding in maintenance tunnels, scavenging ration packs from collapsed buildings, and watching the aliens transform his home into a mining operation. The Velter were methodical. In their conquest they stripped worlds of resources before moving on to the next target, leaving behind hollow husks that served as grim warnings to other species. But Kale had learned things during those months, things that would make the hegemony wish they'd been more thorough in their genocide. He discovered that Velter warriors were surprisingly vulnerable. When separated from their pack units, their exoskeletons could deflect plasma rounds, but a well-placed shard of metal could find the gaps between their chitinous plates. He'd learned that their command frequencies operated on predictable patterns, cycling every 6 hours with mathematical precision. Most importantly, he realized that they thought of humans as weak, emotional creatures incapable of the cold calculation needed for true warfare. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Kale pulled back from the viewport and surveyed his makeshift armory. Salvaged mining charges lined one wall, their timer mechanisms carefully rewired with components from destroyed vehicles. A collection of improvised weapons lay scattered across a workbench, sharpened metal fragments welded to pipe handles, gravity mines repurposed from construction equipment, and a single plasma rifle stripped from a dead Velter soldier. But his true weapons weren't the crude instruments of destruction surrounding him. His weapons were patience, observation, and the growing fury that burned in his chest like a miniature star. Every day, he watched the Velter patrols follow their routes with clockwork precision. Every night, he memorized their shift patterns, their communication protocols, their weaknesses. The aliens had made one critical error in their assessment of humanity. They believed that emotion made a species weak. That sentiment was a liability in warfare. They couldn't comprehend how grief could transform into something infinitely more dangerous, how a broken heart could forge itself into an instrument of vengeance that would cut through their empire like a blade through silk. Kale Voss was no longer the frightened boy who cowered in the ruins while his world burned. He was becoming something else entirely, something that would haunt Velter nightmares for generations to come. The child they left behind was about to teach the galaxy that humanity's greatest strength wasn't their technology or their numbers dotted, was their absolute refusal to accept defeat. The first Velter to die screamed for exactly 4 seconds. Kale had waited in the collapsed ventilation shaft for 3 hours, watching the patrol routes through a network of jury-rigged cameras salvaged from security stations. The warrior moved with the characteristic arrogance of a predator that had never known fear. Exoskeleton gleaming under Meridian's artificial lights, plasma rifle held casually at his side. The creature never saw the monofilament wire. Kale had stretched it across the maintenance corridor at exactly the right height, calculated to catch a Velter at the joint where helmet met thorax. Physics did the rest. The warrior's own momentum turned the nearly invisible strand into a guillotine, slicing through the softer tissue beneath its armored plating. As purple blood sprayed across the corridor walls, Kale dropped from the ceiling shaft with practiced silence. He'd rehearsed this moment countless times, but reality carried a weight that imagination couldn't capture. The dying Velter, as for eyes fixed on him with something approaching disbelief. Not that it was dying, but that a human child had killed it. Kale stripped the creature's equipment with methodical efficiency, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The plasma rifle's biolock responded to a simple electromagnetic pulse from a device he'd built using scraps from the medical center. The communication unit required more delicate work, but months of studying Velter technology had taught him their system's vulnerabilities. 20 minutes later, he was monitoring their tactical frequencies from a hidden position in the depot's lower levels. The Velter search patterns shifted as they realized one of their own had vanished, but their response revealed more weaknesses than strengths. They moved in predictable formations, swept areas they'd already cleared, and relied heavily on their technological superiority. The second kill came 2 days later. This time, Kale used the mining charges he'd been preparing a carefully placed explosive that collapsed a section of tunnel onto a 2-warrior patrol. The blast was calculated to look like structural failure, another casualty of their strip mining operations. But the Velter weren't stupid. As their casualties mounted, paranoia began spreading through their ranks like a virus. By the end of the first week, Kale had eliminated 7 warriors without the hegemony forces understanding what they were facing. Each death was different sniper shots from impossible angles, improvised chemical weapons that ate through exoskeleton joints, gravity traps that crushed bone and chitin with equal efficiency. The Velter command structure began implementing new protocols, doubling patrols and restricting movement to essential operations only. They still didn't understand they were fighting a war. The breakthrough came during Kale's 8th engagement. He'd been tracking a supply convoy when his modified scanner detected something unexpected. A Velter communications array hidden in the convoy's lead vehicle. Not just any ray, but a quantum entanglement communicator capable of instantaneous contact with hegemony command. The ambush was his most complex operation yet. Kale had spent days preparing the route, placing shape charges at strategic points while jury-rigging electromagnetic pulse generators. From medical equipment, the convoy's destruction was spectacular. 5 vehicles vaporized in a chain reaction that lit up Meridian's night sky, but the real prize was the communication array. Intact despite the carnage, Kale dragged it back to his hidden base and spent 3 days reverse engineering its encryption protocols. What he discovered changed everything. The Velter weren't just strip mining Meridian, they were using it as a staging ground for assaults on 3 other human colonies. Worse, they classified humanity as a negligible threat species, recommending minimal security protocols for future conquests. In their reports, humans were described as emotionally unstable, technologically inferior, and incapable of sustained resistance. Kale stared at the intercepted messages until the words burned themselves into his memory. 20,000 humans on each target world, families and children who would suffer the same fate as Meridian unless someone warned them. The Velter expected total victory within 6 months, after which they would move on to softer targets in the outer systems. That night, Kale began planning something that would force the galaxy to redefine its understanding of human warfare. The childhood hidden in the ruins was gone, replaced by something harder and infinitely more dangerous. The Velter thought they were fighting a broken species. They were about to discover they'd awakened something that would haunt their empires, dreams for centuries to come. The quantum communicator's activation sent ripples through subspace that reached human command. In less than an hour, on the bridge of the UES Retribution, Admiral Naya Corvus stared at the impossible transmission with the kind of expression reserved for miracles and disasters. Meridian Colony was confirmed lost 96 days ago, her tactical officer reported, voice strained with disbelief. No survivors. The Velter classified it as completely pacified. Then explain this. Corvin gestured at the holographic display showing detailed hegemony troop movements, supply routes, and strategic assessments. Someone just handed us intelligence worth more than our entire spy network. The transmission included video footage that made hardened officers look away. Velter warriors dying in ways that violated every assumption about asymmetric warfare. The attacks showed tactical sophistication that should have been impossible for a single operator, yet the timestamp signatures were consistent. One person, one human, systematically dismantling an occupation force that should have been untouchable. But the most chilling element wasn't the footage itself, it was the cold, methodical nature of each engagement. No wasted motion, no unnecessary risks, no emotional outbursts, just precise, calculated violence that treated each Velter death as a solved equation. Admiral, the communications officer's voice cracked slightly. The transmission includes a request for tactical support. Whoever this is, they're planning something massive. Meanwhile, on Meridian's surface, Kale was implementing the first phase of what he privately named Operation Extinction. 3 months of careful observation had revealed the Velter's greatest weakness, their absolute confidence in their own superiority. They'd grown complacent, treating Meridian as a secure staging ground rather than hostile territory. Kale intended to shatter that illusion permanently. The first coordinated strike targeted their communication infrastructure simultaneously, across 12 locations. Mining charges, carefully placed over weeks of preparation, severed every hardline connection while electromagnetic pulse devices disabled their backup systems. In the span of 30 seconds, the Velter garrison went from complete situational awareness to operating blind, but communications blackout was only the beginning. Phase 2 involved the water treatment facility that served the alien compound. Kale had spent days studying Velter biochemistry from captured medical scanners, learning that their metabolism relied on specific mineral concentrations that human systems couldn't process. A few carefully introduced compounds synthesized from cleaning supplies and medical waste turned their water supply into something approaching liquid poison. The effects weren't immediately lethal. Instead, they induced a progressive neurological condition that degraded motor functions while leaving consciousness intact. Velter warriors began experiencing tremors, balance problems, and coordination failures that made them easy targets for more direct assaults. By the third day of Kel's escalated campaign, the hegemony garrison had lost nearly 30% of its effective strength. The survivors had barricaded themselves in their central command complex, but their defensive position had become a prison. Without working communications, they couldn't call for reinforcements. Without clean water, their condition deteriorated. Hourly. The psychological impact proved even more devastating than the physical casualties. Velter warriors were selected from birth for their emotional stability and tactical predictability. Fear was a concept they understood intellectually, but had never experienced personally. Now they found themselves trapped in a scenario where death came from shadows, where their superior technology meant nothing, where an enemy they couldn't even identify was systematically destroying everything they believed about warfare. Some began exhibiting behaviors their species hadn't seen in millennia: paranoid scanning of empty corridors, startled reactions to equipment noises, aggressive responses to non-threatening stimuli. Their officers tried to maintain discipline, but command authority meant little when survival itself had become unpredictable. Kale watched their deterioration through hijacked security feeds, feeling something cold and satisfied settle in his chest. This was how his parents had felt during those final moments, helpless, surrounded, watching their world collapse while their enemies showed no mercy. But unlike his parents, Kale had advantages the Velter couldn't comprehend. He wasn't fighting for territory or resources. He wasn't constrained by military protocols or political considerations. He was fighting for something infinitely more dangerous: pure, concentrated vengeance with nothing left to lose. The quantum communicator chimed. With an incoming transmission, Admiral Corvin's face materialized in a holographic display, her expression mixing admiration with something approaching horror. Meridian survivor, this is Admiral Corvin of the Human Defense Fleet. What are your tactical requirements? Kale studied the woman's face for a long moment before responding. I need you to deliver a message to every hegemony command structure in this sector. Tell them that humanity remembers Meridian. Tell them we're coming for the rest. What's your name? Soldier? Kale's reflection stared back from the dead monitor screen, hollow eyes in a face that looked decades older than its 14 years. My name is Kale Voss, and I'm not a soldier. Then what are you? I'm what happens when you leave a human child behind. The hegemony's response fleet arrived at Meridian. 72 hours later, 6 destroyers and a command dreadnought carrying enough firepower to reduce the planet's surface to molten glass. Fleet Commander BlackHFY had built his reputation suppressing resistance movements across the outer systems, and he approached Meridian with a methodical brutality that had made his name synonymous with final solutions. He expected to find a small insurgent cell hiding in the ruins. Instead, his sensors detected a single human biosignature moving freely through areas that should have been under hegemony control. One target. Commander BlackHFY's secondary eyes dilated with disbelief as he studied the tactical display. The garrison reported coordinated attacks by multiple enemy units. Negative, sir. All evidence points to a single operator. Analysis of attack patterns suggests remarkable tactical sophistication, but the logistics are consistent with one individual. Working alone, the implication should have been impossible. No single being, human or otherwise, could have eliminated 47 trained Velter warriors while maintaining operational security, yet the evidence was undeniable. Wherever this human moved, hegemony forces died. HFY ordered immediate deployment of hunter-killer teams with enhanced detection equipment. The human would be run to ground and eliminated with overwhelming force, ending this embarrassment. Before word spread to other resistance cells, what he couldn't know was that Kale had been preparing for this escalation since his first kill. The arrival of enemy reinforcements triggered automated systems throughout Meridian's infrastructure, mining charges positioned along critical support structures, electromagnetic pulse generators hidden in communication rays, and chemical weapons disguised as routine maintenance equipment. Kale had spent weeks transforming the colony into a weapon aimed at whoever tried to reclaim it. The first hunter team died when their transport touched down near the central complex. Shaped charges buried beneath the landing pad channeled the explosion upward with enough force to pierce military-grade armor plating. 12 elite Velter warriors vaporized before they could even disembark. The second team lasted longer, almost 10 minutes, before walking into a corridor filled with weaponized atmospheric processors. The modified air recycling system flooded the area with a compound that reacted violently with Velter respiratory chemistry, causing massive internal hemorrhaging that killed them in agonizing convulsions. By the time the third team reached their target zone, word was spreading through the fleet that Meridian had become something unprecedented in hegemony. Experienced a single-person fortress that turned the planet itself into an instrument of war, but Kel's true masterstroke wasn't defensive. While the Velter focused on hunting him through the colony ruins, he was implementing a plan that would transform their superiority into catastrophic vulnerability. Using schematics downloaded from their own tactical databases, Kale had identified the quantum resonance frequency that synchronized their fleet communications. A carefully modified signal transmitter built from medical scanning equipment and mining sensors could inject false data directly into their command network. The false intelligence was subtle but devastating. Friendly fire coordinates that placed Velter units in each other's target zones. Navigation data that led patrols into prepared ambush sites. Supply schedules that directed resources to locations where chemical weapons waited. Within 6 hours, the hunter teams were inadvertently killing each other while following orders they believed came from Fleet Command. The psychological impact rippled through their ranks as warriors who never questioned their tactical superiority found themselves committing fratricide based on their own communication protocols. Commander HFY watched his forces disintegrate with growing incredulity. 40 years of military service hadn't prepared him for an enemy that could turn the hegemony's greatest strengths, their coordination, their technology, their absolute trust and command authority, into weapons of self-destruct. Sir, we're receiving distress signals from multiple ground units. They're reporting coordinated attacks from positions that should be impossible to reach. Show me. The tactical display updated with real-time casualty reports. Red markers appeared and vanished across Meridian's surface as Velter units were systematically eliminated. But the pattern made no sense. Attack locations suggested the enemy could be in multiple places simultaneously, striking targets separated by distances that would require hours to traverse. The truth was simpler and more terrifying than anything. In their tactical manuals, Kale wasn't moving between attack sites, he was activating prepared positions. That turned the entire planet into an extension of his will. Every explosive charge, every chemical weapon, every electromagnetic pulse generator had been carefully placed during months of preparation. The Velter weren't fighting a human being. They were fighting Meridian itself, shaped into a weapon by someone who understood their weaknesses better than they understood themselves. As the casualty reports mounted, Commander HFY made the decision that would transform Kale Voss from an anomaly into a legend. Rather than continue losing forces to an enemy he couldn't understand, he ordered orbital bombardment of the entire colony. The plasma bombardment turned buildings into vapor and stone into glass, but the human signature persisted. Somewhere in the depths of Meridian's ruins, protected by layers of shielding that should never have existed, something was still alive and still killing. The plasma bombardment had turned the surface of Meridian into a hellscape of fused glass and twisted metal, but beneath the devastation, Kale moved through tunnels that had become his domain. 3 months of preparation had transformed the colony's underground infrastructure into something that defied military comprehension, a subterranean fortress that stretched for kilometers. Beneath the ruins, Commander HFY's tactical displays showed impossible readings. Despite orbital bombardment that should have sterilized the planet's surface, his forces continued dying at an accelerating rate. The humans somehow maintained operational capability, while inflicting casualties that threatened to cripple the entire fleet. "Deploy everything," HFY ordered, his voice carrying the strain of a commander confronting the incomprehensible. Ground assault mechs, close air support, and a full battalion of our finest warriors in this. The battle that followed would be studied in military academies for generations, not for its scale, but for its unprecedented asymmetry. 200 Velter warriors descended on Meridian in armored transports, supported by hovering gunships, and 12-meter-tall combat mechs that could level buildings with their particle cannons. They expected to overwhelm a single human through sheer force of numbers and firepower. Instead, they walked into a carefully orchestrated symphony of destruction. The first transport exploded before it touched ground, triggered by proximity sensors that Kale had salvaged from medical equipment and repurposed into anti-aircraft mines. The blast sent debris through the formation, damaging to other transports and forcing emergency landings in areas where chemical weapons waited. As Velter warriors poured from their damaged vehicles, they found themselves fighting an enemy that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Plasma bolts erupted from hidden firing positions, only to find those positions empty when return fire arrived. Explosive charges detonated beneath their feet with perfect timing, opening sinkholes that swallowed entire squads. But Kel's masterpiece was the way he turned their own weapons against them. Using signal interceptors built from salvaged communication equipment, he'd mapped the frequency signatures of every weapon in their arsenal. Modified electromagnetic pulse generators could disrupt targeting systems at critical moments, causing plasma rifles to misfire into friendly units. Combat mech coordination protocols could be hijacked, turning the massive war machines into instruments of friendly fire. The battle's turning point came when a full squad of elite warriors cornered what they believed was their target near the ruins of the medical center. 12 Velter surrounded a collapsed building where sensor readings indicated human presence, their plasma weapons charged and ready. They found only a holographic projector displaying recorded movement patterns. The real Kale was 3 levels below, watching through hijacked surveillance feeds as he triggered the largest explosive charge. He prepared a shaped nuclear mining device positioned to channel its blast upward. Through the building's structural framework, the explosion vaporized the squad instantly while sending a pillar of superheated plasma through the ruins above. The psychological impact rippled through the remaining Velter forces like a physical wave. Warriors who'd never experienced fear found themselves paralyzed by the realization that their enemy could be anywhere, could strike from any direction, could turn their own technology into instruments of destruction. Combat discipline began breaking down as survival instincts overrode military training. Velter warriors started firing at shadows, calling for evacuation, questioning orders that might lead them into prepared killing zones. Some abandoned their positions entirely, preferring court-martial to facing an enemy that had transformed warfare itself into a form of psychological torture. Commander HFY watched his forces disintegrate through feeds that showed an increasingly surreal battlefield. Bodies lay scattered across the ruined landscape, not human bodies, but the corpses of supposedly superior warriors who'd been outfought by a single adversary they couldn't even locate. "Sir?" His tactical officer's voice carried the strain of someone questioning fundamental assumptions about reality. "Current casualty count stands at 6 to 7%. We're losing effectiveness faster than we can replace losses. How many humans are we fighting?" Sensor readings remain consistent with a single biosignature, but tactical analysis suggests coordination patterns that should require 1 human. HFY cut off the report, staring at displays that showed his elite forces being systematically destroyed by an enemy that shouldn't exist. 1 human child is defeating an entire hegemony battle group. The admission hung in the air like a death sentence. Word of Meridian would spread through the galaxy, carrying implications that threatened the foundation of Velter supremacy. If a single human could accomplish this level of tactical dominance, what could humanity achieve when properly motivated, as if responding to his thoughts? New sensor readings appeared on the tactical display. A human fleet had dropped out of hyperspace at the system's edge, not the rescue force he'd expected, but a full battle squadron moving with the methodical precision of predators. "Who'd found wounded prey?" Admiral Corvin's voice echoed across all frequencies. carrying a message that would be remembered long after the battle ended. This is the Human Defense Fleet. Surrender now, or learn why we don't abandon our children. Below the surface, Kale smiled for the first time in 3 months. The human fleet that emerged from hyperspace bore the scars of a species that had learned warfare from necessity rather than choice. Admiral Corvin's squadron consisted of vessels built for one purpose: inflicting maximum damage on enemies who threatened human worlds. The UES Retribution led the formation, its hull bristling with weapons that had been tested in the crucible of humanity's darkest hours. Commander BlackHFY found himself caught between two impossible situations. Above, a human battle squadron approached with clear hostile intent. Below, a single human continued systematically destroying his forces with tactics that defied every assumption about asymmetric warfare. Sir, the human fleet is demanding our immediate surrender. They're claiming authority under Meridian Protocols. BlackHFY's secondary eyes dilated. Meridian Protocols didn't exist in any legal framework he knew, but the humans were broadcasting them on every frequency as if they were established galactic law. The implications were chilling. Humanity was using this battle to establish new rules of engagement that placed entire species at risk for crimes against human colonies. What are these protocols? His intelligence officer's voice carried the strain of someone translating concepts that violated fundamental assumptions about civilized warfare. Complete annihilation of any species that deliberately targets human civilians. No exceptions, no negotiations, no quarter given. The humans hadn't just come to rescue their lost child, they'd come to deliver a message that would echo across the galaxy. Attacking human colonies would now carry consequences that extended beyond military defeat to species-level extinction. But first, they had to survive the enemy that was still hunting them in the ruins below. Kale moved through tunnels that had become extensions of his nervous system, every vibration and sound carrying tactical information that his enhanced awareness could interpret instantly. 3 months of constant warfare had transformed him from a frightened child into something that existed at the intersection of human ingenuity and pure predatory instinct. The remaining Velter forces had consolidated around their command bunker, a decision that played perfectly into his strategy. Instead of hunting scattered targets across the colony, he could now focus his remaining resources on a single, decisive engagement. The assault began with seismic charges that had been placed during the bunker's original construction, shaped nuclear devices originally intended for deep mining operations, detonated in sequence beneath the fortified position. The explosions didn't penetrate the bunker's armor, but they cracked the geological foundation and severed all external connections. With their stronghold isolated, the Velter found themselves fighting from a position that had become a tomb. Kale's next move demonstrated tactical thinking that bordered on prescience. Rather than attack the bunker directly, he began systematic destruction of its life support infrastructure. Modified atmospheric processors flooded the facility's air recycling system with compounds that were harmless to humans but toxic to Velter physiology. The aliens had superior armor, better weapons, and overwhelming numbers, but they still needed to breathe. As the bunker's atmosphere became increasingly poisonous, panic spread through the surviving Velter forces. Warriors who conquered dozens of worlds found themselves suffocating in their own fortress, while their enemy remained invisible and untouchable. Commander BlackHFY made the decision that would end his military career. He ordered full detonation of their emergency nuclear arsenal, intending to glass the entire colony rather than allow one human child to defeat an entire hegemony expedition. The order never reached its destination. Kale had been monitoring their communications for months, and every nuclear device in their inventory had been quietly sabotaged. During the early phases of his campaign, instead of obliterating Meridian, the weapons experienced cascading failures that turned the bunker into a radioactive furnace. The last transmission from the Velter ground forces was a desperate plea for evacuation. That never came. When the bunker's main reactor failed, it took the remainder of BlackHFY's expedition with it. Above the surface, Admiral Corvin watched the final explosion through the Retribution's forward viewports. The nuclear detonation illuminated Meridian's ruined landscape with harsh light that revealed the scope of what one human had accomplished. Admiral, her communications officer's voice carried awe and something approaching fear. We're receiving a transmission from the surface. Single human, biosignature, requesting extraction. Put him through. The image that appeared on the main screen was simultaneously shocking and inevitable. A 14-year-old boy with eyes that had seen too much and hands that carried the weight of impossible victory. Kale Voss looked nothing like the child who'd been left behind 3 months ago. Admiral Corvin. His voice carried authority that belonged to someone decades older. Mission accomplished. Meridian is secure. Understood. Prepare for extraction. But Kale shook his head, and his next words would reshape humanity's reputation across the galaxy. Not yet. We have other colonies to liberate, and the hegemony needs to understand what happens when they threaten human children. You want to continue fighting. I want them to fear us so much that they never attack a human world again. Kale's expression carried the cold certainty of someone who'd learned that mercy was a luxury humanity couldn't afford. I want them to tell their children stories about what happens when you leave a human behind. The turning point hadn't been a battle, it had been the birth of something new and terrible. A form of warfare that would make humanity's enemies wake screaming for generations to come. 5 years after Meridian, the name Kale Voss had become something whispered in the dark corners of Velter space, not spoken aloud, but transmitted through subsonic frequencies that carried the weight of species-wide nightmare. Hegemony military academies taught entire courses on Meridian Syndrome, the psychological condition that had emerged among warriors who'd encountered reports of the battle. But the galaxy's understanding of what had happened on that distant colony remained fundamentally incomplete. Most species focused on the tactical impossibility of one human defeating an entire expedition. They missed the deeper truth that Admiral Corvin and the surviving members of the human defense fleet carried. Like a sacred secret, Kale Voss hadn't just won a battle. He'd redefined what humanity was capable of when properly motivated. The boy who'd been extracted from Meridian's ruins bore little resemblance to the frightened child who'd been left behind. 3 months of total warfare had burned away everything soft and uncertain, leaving behind something harder and infinitely more dangerous. His debriefing sessions had become the foundation for new military doctrines that transformed human tactical thinking across the outer systems. Asymmetric warfare isn't about fighting with inferior resources, Kale explained to a room full of senior officers whose combined experience couldn't match what he'd learned in a single campaign. It's about making your enemy's strengths irrelevant while exploiting weaknesses they don't know they have. But the lectures and tactical analysis sessions were merely the public face of what Meridian had created. The private reality was more complex and far more terrifying. Admiral Corvin found herself studying intelligence reports that suggested Kale's methods were spreading through human space like a virus. Colony defense forces were implementing Meridian protocols, systematic preparation for asymmetric resistance that treated entire worlds as potential weapons. Children were learning skills that had nothing to do with peaceful coexistence and everything to do with surviving encounters with hostile species. Humanity was becoming something new, a species that had learned to fight with the patient, methodical brutality of apex predators. The Velter hegemony's response had been swift and predictable. They launched retaliatory strikes against 3 more human colonies, expecting to encounter the same emotional, poorly coordinated resistance that had characterized previous conflicts. Instead, they'd found populations that had studied Meridian's lessons and prepared accordingly. Each subsequent battle had ended with complete hegemony defeat and casualty rates that approached statistical impossibility. Worse, human forces had begun taking prisoners not for intelligence gathering, but for demonstration purposes. Velter warriors were returned to their homeworlds carrying testimony about forms of warfare that violated everything their species believed about civilized conflict. The psychological impact rippled through hegemony space like a shockwave. Warrior castes that had conquered hundreds of worlds began experiencing morale failures. When assigned to sectors containing human colonies, some units refused deployment entirely, preferring court-martial to facing enemies who fought like Kale Voss. But the most profound change was happening within human space itself. Kale had become something unprecedented in human history, a living legend whose example was reshaping an entire species' approach to survival. Colonies that had once relied on defense fleet protection were becoming self-sufficient fortress worlds. Children who should have been learning mathematics and literature were instead mastering tactical analysis and asymmetric warfare principles. The boy who'd been abandoned on Meridian had transformed humanity from a species that reacted to threats into one that eliminated them preemptively. "Do you understand what you've done?" Admiral Corvin asked during one of their private meetings, her voice carrying the weight of someone who witnessed historical transformation firsthand. Kale now 19 and bearing the unofficial rank of strategic warfare consultant, considered the question with the methodical patience that had become his trademark. I've ensured that no human child will ever be left behind again. You've done more than that. You've made us into something that other species fear. Good. His response carried no hesitation, no doubt about the necessity of what he'd accomplished. Fear keeps our children safe. The truth was more complex than either of them could fully articulate. Kale Voss had become the embodiment of humanity's response to existential threat, not just willing to fight, but capable of fighting with a level of strategic patience and tactical brutality that redefined what it meant to be human. In the years that followed, other species would develop new classifications for humanity in their diplomatic databases, no longer categorized as technologically inferior or emotionally unstable. Humans were reclassified as a kill-class threat, a designation reserved for species capable of unlimited asymmetric escalation. Parents across the galaxy began telling their children cautionary tales about the human boy who turned an entire planet into a weapon, who defeated armies with nothing but determination and the refusal to accept defeat. The stories varied from species to species, but they all carried the same message: never underestimate what humans were capable of when you threaten their young. And in the deep spaces between stars, where human colonies continued their expansion into the galaxy, children learned new songs about the boy from Meridian songs that taught them that humanity's greatest strength wasn't their technology or their numbers. It was their absolute, uncompromising refusal to let anyone hurt their own. Kale Voss had kept his promise. The galaxy would never forget what happened when you left a human child behind.